Hello Revolution students, and welcome back to another video on China, the Chinese Revolution, area of study 2. In this video we're going to look at two things. We're going to look at the process of Fanshen, the implementation of Fanshen, which meant turning over, and the Agrarian Reform law. Remembering back to our earlier study of the Chinese Revolution prior to 1949, and I remind you that everywhere that the CCP took over, all the areas that they took over, be it within the Jiangxi Soviet, along the Long March, or getting even up to Yunnan, and then during the Civil War, wherever the CCP took over, they implemented their promise of redistributing land. Often these redistribution policies were moderate, so land tended to be taken away just from, for example, absentee landlords, and then redistributed to poor peasants so they had enough to live on and support their families. However, at certain times, this redistribution process, this policy, became more radical or harsher. And we see a similar process occur when the CCP came into power in October 1949 and started implementing redistribution throughout the country. They enshrined this process in law in the Agrarian Reform law, which was passed on the 28th of June 1950. The Agrarian Reform law stated a couple of things, and I've just got two articles down here, which we'll just go through very quickly. I took these articles from the website Alpha History, which is a wonderful website which you should visit to get a better understanding of the Chinese Revolution. So Article 1 stated that the land ownership system of feudal exploitation by the landlord class shall be abolished, and the system of peasant land ownership shall be introduced in order to set free the rural productive forces, develop agricultural production, and thus pave the way for new China's industrialization. That's quite an interesting point there. Develop agricultural production and thus pave the way for new China's industrialization. So contained within this article is the idea that only through the redistribution of land can then industrialization occur within China, within a socialist society. Article number 2 stated that the land, draft animals, farm implements and surplus grain of the landlords and their surplus houses in the countryside shall be confiscated, but their other properties shall not be confiscated. So in Article 2, it's stating that only landlords' surplus land, the land that they don't actually use to grow their own food, and their surplus draft animals, only draft animals, cows, oxen, that they use, or that they don't use themselves but may rent out to other peasants, only those items are redistributed under this Agrarian Reform law. So we can see this is quite moderate initially. If we think back to the video that I did on the Korean War, I remind you that when the Korean War hit China and China became involved in that war, they started fighting the US on the Korean Peninsula. This Agrarian Reform law, the associated Fanshen, implementation of Fanshen, the turning over, which was a mass campaign, it became more radicalised, just as the other mass campaigns such as the Thought Reform campaign, the Sanfan and the Wufan that we've studied previously also became more radicalised. When we're talking about radicalisation, we're talking about landlords, in this case, being treated far more harshly, more of their land getting taken, and then being left with nothing. So let's continue on. Let's look at this. So, as I just stated there, so initially it was moderate. It allowed Fanshen, allowed landlords to retain the land cultivated by their immediate family, as well as rented land and fields farmed by hired hands, which is stated down in those articles, so long as this was no more than half of their holdings. Okay, so a well-off landlord would still be very well off because they could still retain half of their holdings. Yep, they would still be far better off than many poor peasants would, even after land redistribution. However, when the Korean War hit, became a lot more radicalised, and the landlords were not allowed to keep half of their land. And now we go on to Fanshen. So Fanshen means turning over. It involved identifying landlords and putting them through speak business meetings, i.e. public denunciations, in front of people's tribunals and members of a village. You can see there is an example there in that image I have on the side of a public trial of a landlord there. And this happens in 1949. These occurred throughout the country from mid-1950 onwards, after the Agrarian Reform law was passed and Fanshen began. Landlords considered tyrants had their property taken, many beaten and some executed. Good landlords were permitted to keep enough land to support themselves. And as I spoke about before, the Korean War escalated the violence of Fanshen, and there is your key date there, not key date, there is your key figure there. So according to Jasper Becker, he estimates that between 2 and 5 million landlords were executed during the campaign during Fanshen. All right, let's have a look at a couple of historical interpretations now about the Agrarian Reform Law and Fanshen. So the first one is from Jonathan Fenby, and he writes, land reform, which had been launched in 1949, became more rigorous in a newly radicalised initiative. More than 100 million acres were redistributed. The crop area held by poor peasants doubled to 47%, a huge increase throughout China. As with the moves against private businessmen in the wool farm, the campaign was more than economic, aiming to wipe out the remnants of the past that had survived the revolution and to achieve maximum social change. So the Fanshen, this mass campaign of land redistribution, also aimed to crush a class enemy, and with wool farm it was the capitalists, the bourgeoisie. With Fanshen it was the landlord class. The landlord class, which had been a KMT or GMD bastion, was to be isolated and exposed to the people's justice, and after Fanshen they pretty much ceased to exist. Alright, now the second historical interpretation is from Philip Short, and he writes about Fanshen and the Agrarian Reform Law. Within 3 years of the founding of New China, the landlords as a cohesive class, which had dominated rural society since Han times, had simply ceased to exist. In contrast to Soviet practice, Mao insisted that the major role in these movements be played in the movement of Fanshen, not by the public security organs, but by ordinary people. The rationale was the same as it had been in Hunan in 1927 and in the Soviet base areas in the 1930s. Peasants who killed with their bare hands the landlords who oppressed them were wedded to the new revolutionary order in a way that passive spectators could never be. If we take that, if we just unpack what he's saying there, he's saying that peasants who killed landlords were now complicit in the revolution, and they would fight to support the revolution, because if the revolutionary leaders, the CCP, were overthrown by a counter-revolution led by, for example, the Kuomintang, then the Kuomintang would come back into power and put the landlords back into power, and then those landlords would seek vengeance on the peasants who had hurt them, those landlords who had survived, or their children. So anyway, there are two historical interpretations about the Agrarian Reform Law and the Fanshen. I hope you have found this video useful for your study of China Area of Study 2, and I shall see you next time. Goodbye.